What would you do if the world told you to forgive the people who murdered your entire family? This is the story of the people who refused. It was the spring of 1945, and the world was only just beginning to tally the dead. The gates of the concentration camps had been thrown open, and what the liberating armies found there defied comprehension. For the survivors, the skeletal figures who emerged from the horror, the war was over. But for a small secret group among them, a new war was just beginning. They had survived the ghettos, the cattle cars, the selections, the camps. They had watched their families, their parents, their children, their entire worlds be turned to smoke and ash. And when the Allies finally arrived, they did not feel relief. They felt rage. A cold, calculated, all-consuming rage that would not be satisfied by trials, by tribunals, or by the simple act of going home. Because for them, there was no home to go back to. There was only an unpayable debt, and they intended to collect it in blood. They called themselves the Nakam, the Avengers. This was not a metaphorical name. Led by a charismatic and utterly ruthless partisan fighter named Abba Kovner, the Nakam consisted of roughly 50 to 60 Holocaust survivors, most of them former partisans and ghetto fighters. Kovner had witnessed the Vilna ghetto's destruction, and he carried with him a belief that the world had learned nothing. He believed that for Germany to truly be held accountable, it had to feel a fraction of the pain the Jewish people had felt. So they devised two plans. Plan A was apocalyptic in scope. They intended to poison the municipal water supplies of major German cities like Munich, Hamburg and Nuremberg. The goal was nothing less than the death of 6 million Germans, a chilling echo of the Nazi genocide. An eye for an eye, a life for a life, multiplied to an unimaginable scale. They smuggled poisons into Germany, secured access to water mains, and prepared to strike. But in the final days of planning, Kovner was arrested by British forces at the port of Haifa while attempting to carry a concentrated poison solution disguised as a can of evaporated milk. He swallowed the poison to avoid capture, but was forced to vomit it up, and the plan collapsed. The water remains untainted. But Plan B was already in motion. It was a smaller, more focused act of vengeance, but one they were determined to see through. The target was the Stalag 13 prison camp in Nuremberg, where thousands of high-value German prisoners of war, former SS officers and Nazi officials, were being held by the American military. The Nakam infiltrated the camp. One of their members, a former chemist who had survived Auschwitz, obtained arsenic. Others got jobs as bakers, construction workers, and drivers on the base. They baked thousands of loaves of bread laced with arsenic. They smeared arsenic paste on the interior of the bread loaves and also poisoned the camp's food supply. On the night of April 13, 1946, they placed the poisoned bread in the camp's bakery. But because of a bureaucratic delay, the bread sat for 6 days. By the time it was distributed on April 19th, the arsenic had oxidized, rendering the poison far less lethal than intended. Still, over 2,000 German prisoners fell violently ill. It was reported that hundreds were hospitalized, and while no official death toll was ever confirmed, the Nakam knew their strike had landed. For them, it was a partial success. But even a partial success was a victory. They had, in their own minds, shown that Jewish blood was not free. To understand the Nakam, We have to move beyond simple definitions of justice or revenge. We have to step into the psychology of trauma. What these men and women carried was not just grief. It was what psychologists today call moral injury. That's when a person has witnessed or experienced something that shatters their entire sense of right and wrong. Imagine being a parent forced to watch your child die, or being a fighter who couldn't save your community. The world becomes a broken place where the rules no longer apply. For the Nakam, the Nuremberg trials, which had just begun, were an insult. They saw it as justice delivered by the victors on their own terms, a performance that allowed the world to feel clean while the dirt remained under their fingernails. This is where collective identity theory comes into play, specifically the work of social psychologist Henry Tajfel. Tajfel argued that a huge part of our identity comes from the groups we belong to. For Holocaust survivors, their identity had been reduced to one thing: victimhood. The Nakam was attempting to reclaim their group identity by transforming from passive victims into active avengers. They weren't acting as individuals, they were acting as the embodiment of a people. They needed to prove that the Jewish people were not sheep led to the slaughter. In their minds, if they did nothing, if they let the perpetrators live out their lives in quiet suburbs, then the Nazis had won. Their violence was a desperate attempt to rebuild a shattered collective self. This leads us to the moral paradox that lies at the heart of the Nakam story, and it is a paradox with no easy answers. On one side, you have the argument for justice. How do you respond to an industrial-scale genocide? The world had never seen anything like it. The legal mechanisms that existed were untested. The Nakam would argue that the law had failed them. The law had never protected them in the ghettos. Why should they trust it now? They believed that only an act of equal horror could properly signal to the world that such evil would be met with an unflinching response. They operated in what researchers call an empathy gap. When you are in a state of intense emotional or physical trauma, your ability to empathize with the outgroup, the perpetrators, shuts down completely. You cannot feel for the enemy because to feel for them would be to betray the dead. But the other side of the paradox is the argument for humanity. If you poison thousands of prisoners of war, many of whom were rank-and-file soldiers, are you not committing the same crime you are avenging? The Nakam would have rejected that comparison outright, but the question remains. The late psychiatrist James Gilligan, who spent decades studying violence, argued that violence is almost always a failed attempt to overcome shame or to achieve justice when all other avenues are blocked. The Nakam were acting out of a deep, unprocessed shame, the shame of having been powerless. But Gilligan also noted that violence, while it may provide a moment of catharsis, rarely heals the wound. It perpetuates a cycle. When you try to heal moral injury with more violence, you don't cure the wound. You simply pass it on. So we are left with a paradox. Did they have a right to it? And was it wrong? The Nakam believed they were acting in a moral vacuum where no other options existed. Their story forces us to ask, what is the ethical limit of vengeance when the initial crime defies all ethical limits? After the partial success of Plan B, the Nakam began to disperse. The Americans, embarrassed by the poisoning of prisoners in their custody, launched an investigation, but ultimately closed the case, likely never identifying the full network. Many of the members went on to live quiet lives in Israel and the United States. They rarely spoke of what they did. But the leader, Abba Kovner, went on to become a celebrated national poet in Israel. He was a man of immense literary talent and moral complexity.
He carried the secret of the Nakam with him for decades. Before he died of cancer in 1970, he reportedly confessed to his biographer, expressing a mixture of pride and deep sorrow. He said he regretted that Plan A failed. He said he regretted that the world never truly held Germany accountable. But he also lived long enough to see the establishment of the State of Israel, a nation he helped fight for, and he dedicated his later years to building rather than destroying. He remained a figure of fierce, unyielding defiance until the very end. But the question of whether he found peace, that is a question only the dead can answer. You don't have to be a survivor of genocide to understand the impulse of the Nakam. That feeling is a universal human instinct. It lives in anyone who has ever watched an abuser walk free, or a liar succeed, or a bully go unpunished. There is a deep, visceral part of the human psyche that screams when injustice goes unaddressed. We want the scales to be balanced. We want the universe to make sense. The Nakam took that primal instinct and pushed it to its absolute, terrifying limit. They remind us that justice is not a natural phenomenon. It's a construction. And when that construction fails, when the systems we trust to protect us shatter, something raw and ancient awakens in the human heart. It is the desire to become the judge, the jury, and the executioner. Most of us will never act on it, but we have all felt the flicker. The story of the Nakam is not a lesson. It is a question about how much pain a soul can hold before it decides to become the storm. About whether the pursuit of justice can ever justify the act of becoming the very thing you swore to destroy. The bread was baked, the poison was spread. And in the quiet of history the Nakam took their secret to the grave. Whether they were heroes, monsters, or simply men and women who broke under a weight no human should ever have to carry, is a judgment best left to a silence they themselves could never find.